The American Air Museum at Duxford is home to two of the most iconic bombers of the Second World War, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator. These stablemates were the backbone of the US bombing strategy in Europe. On paper, they're a good match. Both are four-engined heavy bombers with similar crew positions, speed, range and bomb loads. But put their performance under the microscope and you'll quickly see that these are two very different aircraft, with two very different reputations. But which bomber had the edge? The B-17 or the B-24? Developed and produced by Boeing, the B-17 first flew in 1935 and entered service with the US Army Air Corps in 1938. The B-24, designed by Consolidated Aircraft, came later, making its maiden flight in 1939. As a newer and more versatile aircraft, surely this gave the B-24 the edge over the B-17. Well, not necessarily. One of the factors in the B-17's favour is that it was the aircraft that US bombing doctrine had been based around. A group of strategic planners, known as the Bomber Mafia, had been enamoured with the B-17 since its maiden flight in 1935. It was during this public debut that the plane, with its heavy firepower and multiple machine gun emplacements, earned the nickname Flying Fortress. With the Flying Fortress at the forefront of their minds, the Bomber Mafia developed a doctrine of high-altitude, daylight, precision bombing against industrial and military targets deep within enemy territory.
These are official pictures of some recent raids. Daylight precision bombing which is severing the arteries of the German nation at war. Round-the-clock bombing in earnest. The four-engined bombers are casting their shadows over the heart of Germany.
The success of this strategy pinned on the B-17 being able to put bombs on the targets and make it back to base, no matter what punishment was thrown at it. Its endorsement as the poster boy for precision bombing gave the B-17 a reputational boost, even before it got into combat. But it also meant that rival companies had a design to improve upon. This was the case for Consolidated, a company that was best known for producing flying boats. When they were asked whether they could build B-17s on license, they refused. Instead, they promised to design their own superior bomber. By the time the new aeroplane, the YB-42, entered production, war had broken out in Europe and the United States had begun supplying aircraft to the British and French as part of the Lend-Lease Agreement. In 1941, the US Army sent both B-17s and B-24s to Britain for combat testing. The results were less than impressive. Most of the B-17s were grounded with mechanical failures, while the Fortress's much lauded bombing accuracy failed to live up to the hype. The B-24, meanwhile, saw much greater success at the hands of the British, not as a high-altitude bomber, but as an anti-submarine patrol aircraft and transport plane. Following the United States' entry into the war, American pilots finally got the chance to put their two primary bombers to the test. After outings for both aircraft in the Pacific, with disappointing results, B-17 and B-24 groups found themselves en route to Europe to take part in the Allied bombing offensive. Both types of bomber would be striking well-defended strategic targets, such as U-boat pens and factory complexes, and they'd be doing it in broad daylight. Everything, not least the lives of the crews, depended on the ability of the B-17 and B-24 to hold up to the wrath of the German air defences. But how would they fare? Looking at the B-17, you're met with that instantly recognisable streamlined fuselage and a tall tail fin that almost feels Art Deco in its design. This is an aircraft that prioritises stability and survivability, and that tail fin is going to play an important role in the Fortress's stability in the air. Meanwhile, the B-24 has a distinctively boxier appearance, with a twin tail on a high-mounted Davis wing. Named after its inventor, David Davis, the long and narrow wing has a lower drag coefficient than the B-17's wing, which gives it better lift and range. Consolidated's amphibious pedigree really comes through in the design of its deep hull-like fuselage. The large bomb bay, created by the shoulder-mounted wings, meant that the B-24 could carry up to 8,800 pounds of bombs, slightly more than the B-17. Its bomb bay doors were designed to roll inside the aircraft, which reduced the drag while they were open. However, The box-like appearance of the B-24 was a source of derision for B-17 pilots, who described the Liberator as the box the B-17 came in. Both aircraft are powered by 4 engines. The B-17 has 4 Wright R1820 radials with turbochargers, while the B-24 is fitted with Pratt & Whitney R1830 radials. Both of these engine types can produce 1200 horsepower apiece. But thanks to the extra lift created by its high aspect ratio wing, the B-24 has a much higher cruising speed than the B-17, around 215 miles per hour compared to the B-17's average cruising speed of 182 miles per hour. It also had better range. Armed with 5,000 pounds of bombs, the B-24 could fly 2,100 miles. In comparison, a B-17 had a range of 2,000 miles when loaded with 4,000 pounds of ordnance. However, the B-17's wide chord wing was much more efficient at higher altitudes than the B-24's Davis wing. This meant that the B-17 had a tactical advantage when flying over enemy territory. On paper, the B-24 had the edge in speed, range at lower altitudes, and payload. But, as we all know, battles aren't fought on paper. And in the war-torn skies over Europe, flak and fighters were oblivious to whether one aircraft could fly slightly faster or further. What really mattered was if a bomber could hit the target and make it back. Reports on bombing accuracy showed that B-17s consistently achieved better bombing results than B-24s. For example, in the last 4 months of 1944, 38% of bombs dropped from B-17s fell within 1,000 feet of the aim point, compared to just 28% for B-24s. One of the reasons for this difference was that most of these missions were carried out at very high altitudes, which favoured the B-17. However, it's interesting to note that the 8th Air Force record for bombing accuracy was held by the 467th Bomb Group, a B-24 unit. The Flying Fortress, as its name suggests, was also an aircraft that was adept at defending itself from enemy fighters. The B-17G had 13 50 caliber machine guns. This gave the Fortress a complete field of fire. The B-24, in comparison, only had 10 50 calibers. The difference in firepower is reflected in the number of enemy fighters shot down. 8th Air Force B-17s averaged 1 Luftwaffe fighter down for every 44 sorties, compared to 1 enemy for every 87 B-24 sorties, almost half that of the B-17. Another important metric is the durability of each aircraft. The B-24 has got a poor reputation in this regard, largely down to its high aspect ratio wing. The shoulder-mounted wing with its single main spar placed significant weight on the fuselage, which could cause it to crumple under the stress of a heavy landing, especially with a full bomb load. There are instances when pilots managed to land their Liberator only for them to be crushed by the top turret landing on them. Another fear that plagued B-24 crews was the prospect of going down over water. Studies showed that B-17 crews were more likely to survive a water landing than those in a B-24. The problem lay in the B-24's big bomb bay doors that allowed water to gush into the fuselage, causing the aircraft to quickly sink. The B-17, on the other hand, was famous for its durability. Crews reported missing half a wing, 2 or even 3 engines out, and still being able to land safely. Photos of shot-up B-17s riddled with flak holes filled newspapers, which went a long way to cementing the reputation of the B-17 as a robust and reliable aircraft. One of the most famous combat veterans was the 91st Bomb Group B-17G 909, which completed 140 combat missions, believed to be the 8th Air Force record for most missions without loss to the crews that flew her. However, not far behind in the rankings is the B-24 Witchcraft, which flew over 130 missions with the 467th Bomb Group without the crew enduring any injuries. And when we look at the figures, there is surprisingly little difference between the loss rates of B-17s compared to B-24s in the European bombing campaign. 4,688 B-17s were lost in combat over 291,508 sorties, compared to 3,626 B-24s downed across 226,775 sorties. That works out at 1 B-17 lost for every 62.1 sorties, compared to 62.5 B-24 sorties. What was it like for the crews manning these 2 aircraft? To a certain degree, it depended where you were in the bomber. Pilots generally found the B-17 easier and more forgiving to fly, while the B-24 was more physically demanding to control, especially at higher altitudes. Better control meant that the B-17s were generally better at flying in tight formations. In terms of crew comfort, the B-17 was considered more spacious than the B-24. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the navigator's position, which was precariously slotted in between the bombardier and the nose wheel, facing the pilot's feet. The tail gunner on the B-24, on the other hand, didn't have the problem of having to crawl to his lonely position at the end of the tail. While we may be able to make assumptions about which aircraft was better with hindsight, the reality is that if you'd have asked an airman with the 8th Air Force if his aircraft was the best, he'd most likely have said yes. In mid-1944, 92% of B-17 crews said that they had the best type of machine, compared with 76% of the polled B-24 crews. Arguably the most important attribute of the B-24 had nothing to do with its accomplishments in the air. The Huck rivet allowed for faster installation compared to traditional rivets that required 2 workers for installation. This was crucial at the Willow Run production plant in Michigan, where labour was at a premium and efficiency was paramount. Willow Run covered 3.5 million square feet, was a quarter of a mile long and had 70 assembly lines. One B-24 rolled off the production line at Willow Run every hour at the factory's peak. A Liberator was made up of 1,220,000 parts, each of which had to be standardised to allow for interchangeability. Streamlined production methods like this helped the consolidated B-24 Liberator to become the most produced bomber of all time. It is the first example of a truly mass-produced aircraft. Despite the service and sacrifice of both aircraft in the European bombing campaign, it's the B-17 that's become synonymous with the air war. Maybe it's because the sleek and stylish bomber was more photogenic than its stablemate. However, it's also worth remembering that the closest American bomber bases to London all operated B-17s. It's therefore no surprise that those news-hungry journalists captured the stories of these resilient B-17 crews rather than venturing further afield to report on B-24 groups. The USAF Strategic Bombing Survey, published in 1947, concluded that, quote, the B-17 was a more efficient combat aircraft than the B-24 from a viewpoint of bomber accuracy, life of aircraft, tons dropped for each effective sortie, and losses for each effective sortie. There's no doubting that the B-17 was better suited to flying the high-altitude, high-risk daylight missions that were required of it in the European theatre. But, despite the bomber mafia's assurances, the war wasn't won through high-altitude bombing alone. The B-24 offered the Allies versatility, from bombing missions over Europe and the Pacific to anti-submarine patrols across the Atlantic. In a war of attrition, it also had the benefit of being produced in record-breaking numbers. Both types of aircraft were retired shortly after the war, replaced by more powerful and technologically advanced bombers. However, the Fortress and Liberator ultimately lived up to their names, with both playing a pivotal role in the liberation of Europe and Allied victory in the air war.